First in our next lineup is Max Lobovsky, the CEO and co-founder of Formlabs. Back in 2011, Max, Natan Linder, and David Craner founded Formlabs with an idea of just creating greater access to digital fabrication. Fast forwarding to today, 11 years later, they've sold more than 100,000 3D printers, and these 3D printers have created more than 100 million parts. Their customers span manufacturing, product design, healthcare, dental, number of verticals, and we're excited to hear what Max has to share with us today. Thanks, Max.
Just wanted to take a second to thank you all for coming to Digital Factory. Formlabs has been putting this event together for a few years, but of course it's been on hold with the pandemic, and we're really excited to bring it back. And I know it's may have been difficult to travel or make the commitment to come here. So thank you all for that. I think it's really important in manufacturing technology to actually see the stuff, see how it works, and to be able to make that leap to adopt something new. And that's actually kind of the sort of the mission for Formlabs from the beginning is based on this idea that we want to expand access to digital fabrication so anyone can make anything. Because my perspective is there's usually a lot more capabilities in manufacturing technology than has been fully adopted in the world. And so there's a lot to be gained by just making it easier to adopt the new technology. And in 3D printing, I think there's been a lot of powerful capabilities for many years now, but it's been too expensive and too difficult to use. And so that's what we mean by expanding access, is solving those sort of barriers to entry. What I'll talk about here in this talk is mostly a little bit of a little show inside some of the interesting things we do in our own manufacturing processes, really sort of targeted at manufacturing nerds. I'll try to come up with some sort of takeaway strategy. That's a broader thing at the end. Not sure if it holds together. But we've had to do a lot of interesting things in our own manufacturing. As Carl said, often the idea is not so hard, but actually executing on it and scaling up is the challenge, and so that's where a lot of our work has gone. It's complicated to make complicated products simple, and our products are fairly complicated. This is the Fuse 1, which is a selective laser sintering machine. We launched about a year and a half ago. And similar machines start at over $100,000. Fuse 1 is less than $20,000. But it actually has pretty much the same level of complexity, or even more than some of those more expensive systems. A lot of electromechanical, thermal, optical, airflow control, all packed into this machine. So a lot of our work goes into how do we put that much capability in that price. And there's a few things we've done to make that happen. One is we go all over the world to find the right suppliers and components. So we have quite a global supply chain across our hardware and materials, even for not a terribly large company. And we need to do that to find the sort of best performance per dollar for everything we're doing. But this is also a source of a huge challenge we had to deal with. So the Fuse 1, we actually brought it to production in the middle of the pandemic without being able to travel to the factory it's made in China. Fortunately, some of the things we've built have helped us address that. This is showing one of the ways that we sort of get this cost-performance ratio up. We actually use lower cost components and then calibrate them, measure them, add software to improve their performance. So this is the Form 3, and it's going through this kind of measurement process that that aligns the X stage to the rest of the machine. And rather than making those components really expensively, we make them cheaply and then measure them with these automated tools we've developed and the software system. And then actually the software system is telling the operator how to adjust the machine, install a couple of shims, and then finally measuring it again after it's done to confirm that it's in the tight tolerance. So a lot of the work we do is going into stuff like this that never leaves our factory, but is part of making that high performance per dollar product. And so we've been building systems like this since the beginning of the company with Form 1. But over the years, we realized that the software that runs these steps, it's actually an opportunity to get a lot of control and feedback out of our factories. And so this software has evolved into something we call TARS now, named after the robot from the movie Interstellar. And it's, originally it was all about just running these calibration processes, and now it's developed into a full-blown MES, or manufacturing execution system. So every single printer runs through dozens and dozens of steps in the software. Some are fully automatic tests that the printer reports back. Some involve inserting tools like some that I showed there. Some involve instructions for operators to actually interact with the printer. And then we log the results from all of these tests back, get them instantly back as printers are passing through the production process. You get really nice charts like this, this showing like a yield of a test and what an acceptable range is and how it evolves over time. And this has been incredibly helpful in dealing with managing production in factories where we can't get our engineers there, as we have a huge amount of insight. So you get to do sort of typical problem solving like this, where you see error in a certain process spike over time, can detect that, take a look at the data and see that it's actually a problem with the calibration equipment, issue a fix remotely and see that error fixed over time, and yeah, again, do it quickly and do it with less physical access. Next thing I want to talk about, totally different thing we do in manufacturing that I think gives us some advantages, is we ship a lot of 3D printed parts in our products. We're a 3D printing company, so of course we want to make good use of our products. But there's good reasons to do this, even if you're not a 3D printing company. So I'll show you some of the parts. This is showing the Fuse 1 again, and a few of the printed parts in that machine. Actually, when you get the machine, the first thing you touch is this handle, is a printed part, and then there's a number of more printed parts, some that are sort of industrial design, cosmetic, external parts, some that are very functional, internal parts. And this is really valuable for a product like this. This is one of our lower volume products, around 1,000 units per year. And that volume is really tough to work in. Injection molded parts that you might want to use to get these sort of sculpted surfaces or unusual geometries are very expensive at that volume and very inflexible. So 3D printing lets us, and so typically a product like this won't have a lot of parts like that. It will be more constrained in its kind of manufacturing choices. But 3D printing gives us a lot of flexibility there. And we've got printed parts in actually all of our major hardware products, including our highest volume Form 3. And you can see from the color coding here, we produce these parts both with our SLS and SLA processes. And so depending on the part, there's different advantages and disadvantages from each process of materials available or surface finish or things like that. And we're producing parts up to volume of around 15,000 parts per year. Here's the inside of our factory in Ohio, where we do most of this production. Also where we produce our materials and also sample parts for customers. So they're running all of our printers and producing several 100,000 parts per year now between what we use for production as well as sample parts. So it's great experience for us to sort of dog food our printers and especially use them in high volume settings because there's different challenges when you're running these machines in higher volume. One thing I want to show you is you typically think of a 3D printer as you just press print, you can get one part out, and you keep pressing print and get many parts out. You can do that, but if you want to optimize it, there are sort of some equivalents to the design for manufacturing processes that you do with other technologies, but for 3D printing. So one example of that is you want to pack your build volume to produce as many parts in one build as possible. In SLS, on the left, you can see almost 100 parts packed into a fairly small build volume, and you could do a similar thing in SLA. So there's some optimization you do for high volume production, but the big thing you don't have with 3D printing that you have with most other volume processes is an expensive piece of tooling that takes a lot of time to produce. And so this gets to one of the main reasons we're using printing in production. And that's because it can be more cost effective than similar processes. So I'll walk you through this chart. This is one of the ways you can kind of look at how cost compares between different manufacturing processes. On the x-axis, we have the total number of units you'll produce with that for a given part. And on the y-axis, you have the per part cost, assuming you produce that many units. And 3D printing is in blue there, and so it's pretty much the same cost if you produce 1 or 1,000,000 of the parts. It's not totally true, but it's a good enough assumption here. And then injection molding is that orange line, and it has this very precipitous drop in price from low volumes, and it starts extremely high. It actually starts way off this chart in the many thousands of dollars for the first part, and that's because you have to make this piece of tooling. But typically injection molding will be cheaper for the marginal part. So once you make a lot of parts, you can amortize the cost of the tooling and get to a lower per part cost. And this leads you to this kind of break-even point where there's some volume at which below 3D printing will be more cost effective, and then above that volume, injection molding would be more cost effective. And this is a chart for this turntable gear part I'll show you. And so it depends on the part exactly what these numbers will look like. Here's a lot of numbers, but this is showing 5 different parts, and on the right you could see the break-even volume for that part versus injection molding, and the lifetime volume that we're expecting to produce for that part. I highlighted in green the ones where our lifetime volume is lower than the injection, that break-even volume, meaning it's cheaper to make them with 3D printing. So not every part meets this requirement. Turns out there's other good reasons to 3D print parts that I'll get into. The other interesting thing is there's a few times where we've switched something from injection molding to 3D printing, or vice versa. So if you have a very stable part and maybe you do want to get that next level of cost optimization, you can switch to injection molding. Or if you've got a part that you did with injection molding, but now you need a new revision that would require a new tool, maybe it makes sense to switch to 3D printing. So it's clear that that break-even volume is a really critical parameter here, because that limits how many applications will make sense with 3D printing. And so one of our main goals as a company is to drive that cost down. So like if you take just that example from earlier, if we were able to cut the per part cost with 3D printing by half, we'd move that break-even volume out 5 times, and that part now could make sense in more applications to be done with 3D printing. If you're able to go another 10 or 20% further, it would actually be cheaper at any volume with 3D printing. You can go even further. So we're putting a lot of effort into this in automation and other things that will help bring this number down over time. But even where it is today, as you saw from the previous chart, sort of the 1,000 to 10,000 break-even range. That's kind of typical today. There's a lot of products in that area. Some of our competitors are talking about getting 3D printing into super high volume consumer products like cars or consumer electronics. That may happen someday, but the much shorter term opportunity is this big range of products in this kind of thousands range. Medical devices, aerospace, industrial equipment, things that are part of building and construction. There's a lot of stuff made in this volume, and only a small fraction of it is really adopting 3D printing today. So the next thing, I want to show you a couple parts and talk about why they make sense even sort of separate from the simple cost argument. So this is the turntable gear I mentioned that's in those charts. It's in our Form Cure product. It's basically turns a little microwave stage in this machine. And this sort of part usually would require some refinement. A gear has kind of tight tolerances, and it can be hard to get that right with any manufacturing process on the first iteration. And so if you're doing it with injection molding, you will often have to modify the tool, and that means you'll have a really long time to get a part like this into production. So you could look at a timeline like this. Even for a fairly simple part, initial tool takes 4 weeks to make. You'll test it out, do some adjustments, then you'll have to modify the tool and end up with something like 9 weeks for injection molding. With 3D printing, the production is essentially instantaneous on this scale, and you spend all your time on just designing and testing and verifying. You can get a part like this rolled out much faster. And in this case, we use that to our advantage. We did have to make an adjustment to the 3D printed design, able to do that very quickly, even as we were ramping up production, and in fact, printed the part simultaneously in China and in the US, so to be able to validate it in the US and ramp up production in China. Another really good example is using 3D printing to get to performance that you can't get to for other parts. So this is a sort of a gas flow manifold that goes in front of the infrared temperature sensor in Fuse, keeps it clean. And you want to really control that airflow to minimize the level while still having it function. And so on the left is a cross-section of that part, and you can see this internal structure that's necessary to get that kind of optimum airflow. And you can't make this part with injection molding as is at all. You can probably get to something with somewhat similar but less ideal function if you make it out of a number of different parts. But if you're really optimizing for the functionality here and you want that ideal geometry, 3D printing is the way to go. So there's sometimes a pure cost argument, there's sometimes a time or performance argument, and sometimes a little bit of a combination of the both when you're sort of within striking distance on cost. The last example I want to talk about of something that we've printed in production, this doesn't go into our printers, but it's something I'm really proud of, want to mention. Nassim Taleb, actually, when he was talking, he took out one of these things. It's a 3D printed COVID test swab. And during the pandemic, there was a huge shortage of all sorts of medical devices and equipment and all that. And some of our customers figured out that they could print directly a COVID test swab. They ran clinical trials in hospitals and figured out they performed just as well. And basically in a matter of weeks, went from no one at Formlabs had ever heard of a COVID test swab to being in volume production of a Class 1 medical device and helping to address the shortage. And it was a really cool result. It was a great thing to get the team rallied around during sort of the dark days of the pandemic and contribute to the fight against the pandemic. And it leaves us with sort of this case study of what 3D printing, how it can address supply chain shortages. And as I thought about all these examples and then the COVID test swabs, I realized that like all those things I showed you, they've helped us to be much more resilient in the face of these supply chain shortages, but we didn't do any of them with that goal in mind. Everything I showed you was with the goal of faster time to market, more agility. Carl Bass talked about startups getting hardware products wrong, and we're deathly afraid of that, so we try to keep as much flexibility to change direction and iterate. And so those are the things we focus on. But I think those same sort of goals of agility and speed in your product development lead to robustness in your supply chain. And perhaps to Taleb's concept of anti-fragility, he's very precise with the definition of that, so I don't know if we actually meet the criteria here. But I think the point is that not only do we survive shocks to the supply chain, but we actually get stronger. And I think we saw that happen. We actually grew in 2020 and 21 when a lot of our competitors were shrinking and struggling to deal with shortages. And I think another great example of that is if you look at like Tesla versus Ford or GM. Tesla has massively ramped up production through 2021, while Ford and GM were shuttering their production plants. And that's because they were rapidly iterating, changing out components, and they had the sort of the speed and flexibility to do that. So yeah, maybe this is sort of a takeaway, is orient yourself around speed and flexibility in product development, and that will also bring robustness in your supply chain. Thank you.